on issues of concern to women, women's health and safety, women's equality and the like. And he's promoted Michaelia Cash, the former Jobs Minister, to the position of Attorney General, and Karen Andrews, the former Industry Minister, to position of Home Affairs. The Home Affairs Minister, sometimes controversial, Peter Dutton, has gone to the Defence portfolio, which he has wanted for some time, but which the Prime Minister had resisted moving into in the last reshuffle. But now we've had the deck chairs changed around. Nobody's dropped from cabinet, but those two other ministers take on new jobs within the cabinet. So he's trying to sort of not demote anyone, but actually he really has by moving those two ministers.
Is Home Affairs related to some of the more controversial matters you have to do with New Zealand, for example, the 501s?
It is correct, that's right. Immigration falls within Home Affairs. So Karen Andrews will now take carriage of the overarching portfolio there.
And one of the difficulties around the Christian Porter situation in particular is that the Attorney General is the first law officer of the land. And again, these are allegations that he denies, but nonetheless, there is no more important position really in your legal infrastructure, at least on the political side of things. Was that just seen as an impossibility in the end?
Yes, I think politically the Prime Minister realised it was becoming too difficult. He took advice from the Solicitor General, but also Christian Porter is suing our public broadcaster, the ABC, for first breaking this story, albeit without his name attached. And it seems just too difficult to be embroiled in a very high-profile defamation case against the public broadcaster while you are overseeing the law and being the first law officer. So that's the argument behind it.
Karen, thank you so much. As always, it's appreciated. Australia correspondent Karen Middleton. Alec McGillis, the journalist, next on his book, which looks at how Amazon rose to the incredible level of dominance it has, both as a business and in online transactions. That story next on 9 to Noon.
RNZ News at 10 o'clock. Good morning, I'm Nicola Wright. A medical specialist says ACC should cover the cost for women who suffer from perineal tears during childbirth. Perineal tears are the most common type of birth injury, but ACC coverage has fallen since the agency realised its former policy was more generous than legally required. Obstetrician and Auckland University lecturer Michelle Wise says up to 7% of low-risk new mothers sustain a severe tear, which means almost 500 women are affected each year. She says some have to wait far longer than they should for treatment due to the long waiting list in the public health sector and the high cost for private care. A renters advocacy group says caps on rent increases are needed to help people who are struggling with high housing costs. Property managers and landlords have threatened to raise rents since the government announced it's requiring owners of investment properties to pay tax on their income. There's a 4-year transition period for the changes, which take effect from October. Renters United spokesperson Ashok Jacob says rent caps have proved to work in countries like Germany.
Rent caps are a fairly effective short-term solution to take the pressure off of people who are really struggling.
Ashok Jacob from advocacy group Renters United. Illegal plantings of gold kiwifruit in China are continuing to soar. Last year, kiwifruit exporter Zespri estimated there were 4,000 hectares of unlawful plantings of the New Zealand-bred fruit. It now believes that has jumped significantly. Zespri owns the rights to Sun Gold, and growers here pay a premium to grow it. A Zespri manager, Carol Ward, says the spike in illegal plantings in China is extremely worrying.
Yeah, we have over 8,000 hectares of Sun Gold in New Zealand. So 5,400 hectares in China is a pretty significant portion of that. This is our variety, which continues to spread up in China.
Carol Ward says Zespri's efforts to curtail the plantings have not worked, and it wants growers to approve a trial in which some of the unauthorised fruit would be sold under the Zespri brand. Redundancies and funding cuts are putting at risk the future of the international education industry. The International Education Association says staff working with foreign students are under pressure. Our education correspondent, John Gerritsen, reports.
More than 230 people from schools and tertiary institutions responded to the association's survey. Half said the fall in foreign enrolments had affected them significantly, and half said it had caused staff cuts. Just over half wanted more financial support from the government, and 25% wanted clearer information about when the borders might reopen. The association says its members are worried the sector will not bounce back if it loses good staff while the borders are closed. Ko John Gerritsen, TNA.
Health authorities in Berlin have paused the use of the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine due to concerns about potential side effects. Earlier this month, German authorities had given the vaccine the go-ahead following an earlier suspension. Trent Murray reports from Berlin.
The city of Berlin has suspended the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for people aged under 60. The city's health minister said she wanted to wait for some additional guidance from Germany's health regulator regarding possible side effects from the jab before allowing its use again. In a handful of cases, some people who received the AstraZeneca jab in Germany went on to develop a rare type of blood clot in the brain. Experts are assessing whether there is any link, but the European Medicines Agency continues to maintain the British-Swedish-made jab is safe for use. Trent Murray, Berlin.
Chinese officials are warning other nations not to react to its radical overhaul of Hong Kong's political system, which tightens Beijing's control over the island. Beijing's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying is defending the changes. Her words are translated.
The improvement of the electoral system of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is a step-by-step development that conforms to Hong Kong's restricted order. It's conducive to improving the effectiveness of community governance. Hong Kong will usher in a brighter future.
China has reduced the number of elected seats in Hong Kong's government and increased those directly appointed by Beijing. That's the news.
This morning on First Up, a Pike River widow says that she never signed off on a letter accepting the decision to abandon the drift recovery.
Like, not all the families were at the meeting last night, nor were they all invited, so I don't see how they're saying that all members have agreed to it, and I, for one, definitely didn't.
And a Banksy painting sets a new New Zealand record.
Well, I've spent my whole life around the art auction industry, and last night was just outstanding. $1,455,000. It's the second painting sold under the hammer over $1 million in New Zealand.
First Up with me, Nathan Rarere, 5 a.m. weekdays on RNZ National.
Back to Catherine Ryan next. First, the forecast from Met Service to midnight. Northland to Waitomo, showers. Some may be heavy and could be thundery. Taranaki to Manawatu, including Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Taumarunui and Taihape. Occasional rain, heavy at times, with the chance of thunderstorms in Taranaki, clearing to isolated showers this evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, scattered rain at times, clearing tonight. Wairarapa, Horowhenua, Kapiti Coast, Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough, outbreaks of rain. Some heavy and could be thundery. Canterbury's mostly cloudy, drizzle from afternoon, and turning to rain in the north this evening. Buller, Westland and Fiordland, scattered rain north of Hokitika this morning and afternoon. May be heavy and thundery in Buller, fine further south. Otago and Southland, mostly cloudy, scattered showers clear this evening. And the Chatham Islands, occasional rain. 10:06 on RNZ National. News and weather again at 11.
Nicola, thank you very much. You are listening to 9 to Noon with Catherine Ryan on RNZ National. Kirsten Johnstone's here after 11 with music for us. Emma Smart had something like 900 board games. She is the co-founder of a Wellington board game cafe. And interestingly, there's something like 5,000 new board game cafes all over North America. It seems to be becoming a big thing. Anyway, we'll hear what you can get up to at the Counterculture Board Game Cafe and Bar. About 11:25. Mark Amery with what is happening in the world of the arts at 11:45. The party line, Sue Orr's reading continues at 11:45, and before that, our book reviewer today is Zoe Fletcher, who's been reading Time to Remember by Jana Ruth, I'm not sure which it is. 10:07. Our guest now has written a book about the behemoth that is Amazon and what lies behind that one easy click. Headquartered in Seattle, it is the second biggest private workplace in the United States behind Walmart, employing more than 800,000 people. Its chief executive, Jeff Bezos, is the richest person alive, and the company has just had its most profitable year in history as more people than ever shopped online due to the coronavirus pandemic. Alec MacGillis is an award-winning journalist for ProPublica, whose works previously appeared in the Washington Post, the Baltimore Sun, and the New Republic. He's also published a biography of the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, back in 2014. We might see how he feels about updating that a little later in the interview with recent events. His new book, Fulfillment, Winning and Losing in One-Click America, looks at Amazon's far-reaching impacts across the United States and the growing inequality from a regional standpoint, the winning cities and those that have been left behind. Alec McGillis is with us from Washington, DC. Welcome. Thanks very much for your time, Alec.
Well, thanks for having me. And just to be clear, I'm actually in Baltimore right now.
Oh, there you are. Okay, I'll move you. Thank you. There's been other books about Amazon, of course, and the story behind it and its founder and the experience of workers. What is it that you particularly wanted to focus on in your book?
I really wanted to focus on the landscape of inequality in America. This book actually started out as a book about regional inequality, all the regional disparities that have been growing in our country between sort of what I call winner-take-all cities, mostly on the coast, such as Seattle, San Francisco, Washington, Boston, New York, and then a whole swath of other cities that have been really kind of left behind in our economy right now. We've always had richer and poorer places in America, of course, but the gaps have just gotten so much bigger in recent years. And I use Amazon as the frame to sort of tell the story of how this is happening and why it's a bad thing for both sorts of cities.
So it is part of the big five, these big tech giants, and it is a tech company, even if it is delivering real, practical, physical goods. These big tech giants have just eaten everybody else up, essentially. And at the start, I want you to address something you do in the book, which is how that has been possible. At what point did the approach to US antitrust laws either change or wither to an extent that this kind of dominance became possible?
That's a very good question, because that weakening has played such a big role in what's happened here. The withering really started in a serious way in the 1970s, and then really intensified during the Reagan years in the 80s, and we're still basically we're now sort of still experiencing that very lax approach to antitrust, which has helped sort of abet the growth of these giants. And what's happened as a result is that, to put it very crudely, all sorts of business activity that used to be kind of spread around the country in various sectors of the economy is now increasingly dominated by a handful of companies, and that commerce and that activity and that wealth is kind of sucked into the places where they reside. And so increasingly media revenue that used to be spread all around the country flows to San Francisco, because that's where Google and Facebook are, and they now control 60% of all digital ad revenue in the country. And similarly, retail revenue that used to be spread all around the country is now increasingly sucked to Seattle, where Amazon, which now controls nearly 50% of all e-commerce, resides. And so you end up with this incredible concentration of wealth in certain places that's linked to the concentration of the economy in certain companies.
That 50% has nearly doubled. I think I recall when it was something like 20 or 25%, and that was just a few short years ago, and we were talking about how shocking it was. And let's be clear, e-commerce as a percentage of all commerce has undoubtedly swollen massively in that time as well.
Vastly.
So what happened? Because what happened to competition is good. What happened to you can't take over that company? I know this is particularly the case of Facebook. You can't take over that company because that would be anti-competitive. What happened?
Well, there was a real shift in thinking that was very deliberately kind of pushed by mostly on the political right here in the States, but eventually actually sort of embraced across the board. And that shift in thinking was, to put it simply, that as long as consumer prices stayed low, that monopoly was okay. That it became known as the consumer welfare test. If we see that prices really are rising on a given product as a result of monopoly, then we can still take action. But if prices stay low, then what's the big deal? That's the only test that was sort of used to assess whether some company had grown too dominant. So something like Amazon, a company like Amazon can point to the fact that they were still offering all sorts of cheap goods cheaply on their website, and say, look, what's the problem with us having such incredible dominance in the American economy? Only more recently, in the last few years, have have experts started to articulate a very strong case for why this is an inadequate way of thinking about the problem, and why Amazon's growing dominance and that of the other tech giants is in fact distorting the economy and harming the sort of the common welfare, even if they're seemingly keeping prices low, or in the case of Google and Facebook, essentially offering their main product for free.
So that, what's the big deal is actually the subject of your book, that single metric is proving so flawed. You have to give credit always to these companies. They are very good at what they do, and they've got very good at what they do very quickly. With Amazon, what is, before we look at the consequences, what is the genius? Was it first mover advantage, or is it just done everything better? Or has it crushed competitors? Like, what is behind this phenomenal dominance?
There was definitely a first mover advantage at work. There was also their famous ability to convince investors to accept very small negligible profits for years for the promise of future growth. That was, of course, a big part of their success, and just this incredibly aggressive playing of their tax advantage in the early years. So much of the story of their success was their ability to take advantage of the fact that e-commerce allowed them to skirt having to assess sales taxes on their products. So it was right off the bat, you had that 5 or 6 or 7% advantage over brick and mortar retailers that had to assess sales taxes. And for many years in the early going, e-commerce was able to avoid that sales tax, and so that gave you this big advantage. And Amazon pursued that so aggressively to the point of actually having it play a big role in their siting decisions. The one reason they started up in Seattle was that if they had started in California, where the other tech companies were, they would have had to assess sales taxes, at least in California. But that was, of course, the biggest state in the country, the biggest market, and they didn't want to have to do that. So they went to a smaller state of Washington State. And then from there on, they kept deciding where to put their warehouses based on allowing them to continue avoiding sales taxes in large markets. It's only been more recently that they've gotten so big that they had to put their warehouses everywhere, essentially, and they've now
teams in Parliament, so health ministers, and then we've also offered health and COVID-related spokespeople from other parties the opportunity to have their vaccines as well. We are doing this as a sign of confidence in the vaccination program, a move of support for those who are working on our front lines, who we've been asking for some weeks now to come forward and be vaccinated. We're well through the border workforce now. It continues to be a bit of a rolling total, though, because people do cycle in and out of the border workforce, and so that number continues to grow. We've made a start on their families and made a reasonably good start on our frontline health workforce as well. So I can give you the latest numbers. As of midnight last night, 66,296 doses of the Pfizer vaccine have been administered. So that's about 52,183 people. 16,483 of those have had the full two doses. So the figures are increasing, starting to really increase now. So we did about 5,500 doses were administered yesterday, and that we expect that number to just incrementally go up to sort of around 7,000 or 8,000 a day, and then maintain that level over the next couple of months before we start to see the big shipments of the vaccine arriving towards the middle of the year. So we've got that running smoothly now. More and more vaccination sites are coming on board, like this one, to make the vaccines more accessible. We have more than 50 sites operating now as of this week, and that will continue to increase over the next few weeks.
If you know how many doses were administered yesterday, why not release a daily figure?
Look,
because then the New Zealand public can see how we're tracking.
Yeah, look, I mean, ultimately the numbers are quite small in the beginning, and they'll now start to get bigger numbers, and so we will release more regular updates, and we will start to release daily updates soon as well.
When you say it's running smoothly now, what issues did you face at the beginning?
Look, they were all just the minor issues that you would expect. Sometimes just understanding human behaviour was one of the things that they had to work their way through. So we know in the early days, for example, some of the people who were booked in didn't necessarily arrive when they were booked. They might have walked in at a different time, sometimes before, sometimes after, when they were booked. So, it's just some of that demand management, making sure that all the systems and logistics were flowing smoothly. That's been a big focus for the first, sort of month or so of the campaign, because obviously we want to scale up sustainably. We want to know that when we have to really ramp up to doing 50 or 60,000 a day, that we've actually got all the systems in place. So we've been able to iron out any kinks in that system as they've been, scaling up.
Why aren't you releasing a daily total? Is it because you're a bit embarrassed about the numbers, or is it because you think that why not?
It's just a matter of making sure the systems are all flowing smoothly, that we have confidence in the numbers that we're releasing. So we will certainly be starting to release more regular updates, probably a daily update. Sometimes there can be a bit of a lag time, particularly over the weekend, for example. The number compilation, takes a little bit of time on a Monday to sort all of that out. But we will look at making that regular now.
When do you think that will happen?
Within the next week or so, we'll start releasing much more, frequent and regular updates.
If you're still vaccinating border workers and their families, have you taken the vaccine sort of out of their arms, so to speak?
Sorry, what?
If you're still vaccinating border workers and their families, do you think it's appropriate sort of that you are both getting the vaccines now, perhaps or is it at the expense of them?
No, we do have a good supply of vaccines now, so we've, we're well on our way through our tier 1 and 2 people. Supply of vaccines for people in that category is not an issue. We do have enough vaccines. It's one of the reasons that we've done the 4-tier, if you like, framework to make sure that we can get the vaccines to the people who need that. What we did see, and I've talked about this before we made the decision about when we would start to be vaccinated. We did see from people that there was just some feedback from people saying, well, if the vaccines are so good, how come none of your elected representatives are getting the vaccine? On the other hand, you've also then got on the other side, are you jumping the queue by doing the vaccine? So we worked really hard just to try and get the balance right here. None of us want to be seen to be jumping the queue, but we also have to recognise that actually people are looking to us to demonstrate confidence in the vaccine program.
So what hasn't the Prime Minister
Look, the Prime Minister will get a vaccine, but again, she has the balancing effort here to make sure that we're not seen to be jumping the queue. With regard to the health ministers, we obviously are people who are more likely to be interacting with our frontline health workforce, who are the people who are in the current prioritisation framework.
Surely she's the leader of the country and quite popular and quite closely watched. Wouldn't you get more bang for buck having her out in front of the cameras?
Oh, look, we certainly will be having a number of other people being vaccinated over the next couple of months, including the Prime Minister, the Director General of Health, a variety of other people who you would expect to be vaccinated and to be showing leadership. They'll certainly be doing that.
In terms of your target for vaccinations, are you meeting those targets of where you wanted to be and where you are?
I think Dr. Bloomfield went through this. We've had a little bit of a lag in the sense that we might have been sort of getting up around 96% of our target. That I'm reasonably comfortable with that. Getting a sort of a 96% of the delivery model on a daily basis. So we want to see that continuing to increase. Obviously, our target continues to increase day on day.
Is it fair that we can't measure you against those targets because we don't know what they are and we don't know what you're delivering?
Oh, look, I'm certainly conscious of that. We will release more information. We've released the broad framework, which just gives you an idea of how the vaccine program ramps up. There was some fluidity around that in the first few weeks, trying to understand, okay, how many vaccines a day can someone who is working full time, how many doses can they actually administer in a day? So we now understand more about that. So we can then therefore sort of finalise the model. So it was a little bit fluid in the beginning because we just had to understand exactly how that was all going to unfold.
You guys spoke about wanting to inoculate sort of trusted members of society and that sort of first to put trust in the vaccine. Do you think politicians, as perhaps among the most least trusted in society, was a good way to go?
Look, I think people, look to members of Parliament for leadership. They have looked to members of Parliament for leadership on COVID-19 generally. We've seen a good degree of trust and confidence in the overall response to COVID-19. And I think it's important that we demonstrate leadership when it comes to vaccines.
You didn't want to bring in some firefighters or teachers or sort of more traditional...
We're leading the vaccination campaign. We need to show that we have confidence in the vaccine.
If that's the case, just about Māori, why is it that Penny Kennedy has to wait till next week? Why couldn't he be done today?
Oh, look, that's just purely logistics. So it's a question of where people are. Parliament's not sitting this week, and then we've obviously got the Easter break. So it really just depends where people are. The health ministers all have clearance to do that any time over the next couple of weeks, as do the health spokespeople from the other parties. I know Andrew Little, for example, was going to do his today, but he is in an area where there isn't a vaccine station set up, and we didn't want to set one up specifically for him, and so therefore he'll wait until he's back in range, if you like, so that he can get his vaccine then.
And are you concerned about the mistrust that's still out there among Māori communities when it comes to vaccination?
Yes, we are concerned about the degree of misinformation that's out there. That's one of the reasons why I have done it today, and why you'll see other political leaders doing that as well. We're working really hard to get good, impartial, fact-based and health-based information out there so people can make informed decisions. What we are finding is that where people maybe didn't come forward at the first available opportunity, as they've seen more people they know being vaccinated, as they've sort of understood that it is safe, they've been more likely to come forward.
Have you updated your surveys that were done last year, which tried to measure the level of hesitancy or what?
I don't think we have done any further polling, but I have seen public polling done through the media, which suggests that that gap is closing up a bit, which is a healthy thing. That's very good.
Have you looked to clamp down via the social media channels on some of the worst disinformation? Because it just seems to be getting through, and the viewership and readership stats for the most vulnerable communities are very high for YouTube and Facebook in particular.
I know that Facebook, Google, and the big IT networks are looking at making sure that they're flagging up information that's misinformation, and in some cases removing it. Obviously, there's they have a balance here to strike around free speech as well, and so making sure that people are getting their information from trusted sources is really, really important. So my advice is someone down the road's reckonings on a vaccine isn't going to be as reliable as the information you'd get from the Ministry of Health or from the Covid-19 pages and so on.
So are you happy with what Facebook and Google/YouTube are doing?
So far, yep. Look, they have a balance here that they have to strike as well, but I do believe that they've been reasonably proactive in this space.
The high-risk people in high-risk settings, South Auckland, were scheduled to get their first vaccinations at the end of the month. It's not the end of the month. Is that about to happen, or has that started?
Yes, it has. I think it has started, but I'll get you some information on that. Basically, what they're doing is scaling up the number of sites that are available. Obviously, they're making sure that they're getting the border workforce absolute front of the queue, then through their families, then through the frontline health workers, and then expanding out into those other categories.
Are you concerned about the report yesterday where people showed up for their appointments but missed out, and people who were able to walk in got jabbed instead?
So like I said, that's one of the things that we've been working really hard to refine in the early days, because we want to get this absolutely right for when we do the big scale up, to make sure that we've got the demand management right, that we're modelling correctly. Bookings are an indicator of roughly how many people might get vaccinated in a particular place on a given day, but they're not 100% accurate, because you do get some no-shows for bookings, you do get more walk-ups, and trying to understand exactly how that what the patterns are there means that we can make sure we've got the supply in the right place at the right time. We will have, as we start to scale up and we have bigger number of sites available, we will have a sort of effectively rapid courier services operating. So if one of our vaccination sites says, look, we were expecting to do 1,000 people today, and we've it's lunchtime and we've already done 800, we will get more to them within about 2 or 3 hours. Similarly, if a site says, we were expecting to do 1,000, but we've only done 200 by lunchtime, you can come and take some from us. We will do that. We want to make sure that we're moving the vaccines around to where people are. We definitely don't want to be wasting them. So again, just making sure all those networks, all those systems are really well oiled as we continue to scale up has been really important.
Have there been any issues with people missing or not coming in time for their second vaccine appointment? And will the data that you guys release in the next week or so have metrics around making sure that that's happening?
We will be looking ultimately to make sure that people are getting their second dose broadly within that sort of 3-week time frame. After 3 weeks, there will be some movement there. If people are away, for example, there may be a little bit of a delay. People who having their vaccinations at work, as we know from testing, sometimes there can be a little bit of a lag if they're rostered off. And they get their next dose when they're next rostered on. But we will be monitoring that. The second doses. The overall raw numbers that we've seen so far are broadly reflective of the number of first doses administered, 3 to 4 weeks ago. So we know that people are coming forward.
I think the important thing on that is that when you're due for even if you're late for your second dose, just make sure you get it.
Yeah.
Pfizer said last night that it was increasing its output to 2.5 billion doses this year. Have you looked at accelerating or bringing forward the vaccination program?
Look, if we can get Pfizer doses earlier, then of course, we'll be looking to scale up earlier. At this point, Pfizer has indicated that our big deliveries won't be starting until July. And that was the basis, that we signed out a contract with them. Obviously, we've always said to them, though, if you can get them to us earlier, we'll move faster.
So will you be going back to them now that...
Those discussions happen all of the time. There's huge demand for Pfizer. It is proving to be a very popular vaccine, but we're certainly doing everything we can to make sure that they know that we're ready to go when those vaccines arrive in the country.
Since last week on the impact of those EU export control, changes on our vaccine.
It's something that we're monitoring very closely. The feedback that we've had from Pfizer and through diplomatic channels through the EU suggests that it shouldn't cause a disruption to New Zealand's vaccination program. But obviously, we always keep an eye on things.
And that feedback from Pfizer and from the EU has been within the last week?
Yes, that's right.
Minister, with the vaccines you were talking about having them every 3 weeks, if you miss that 3-week time period, how long have you got to have the second vaccination to make you 100% protected?
You just need to make sure it's done. And remember, the 2 doses is up to 95% protected. We don't know if delaying influences the efficacy of the vaccine, but we know from all other vaccines, it's better just to get the second dose done rather than to think, I've missed my window. You haven't, just present and get it done at the clinic you were at.
Confident with, given those numbers, there were only 16,000 who had the 2 full doses. You're confident that the 52,000 people who haven't yet, there's enough for them the systems are working to make sure there's enough for their second dose?
Yes, yeah.
That's been one of the things around inventory management, just making sure that we don't move too fast and therefore end up with people not being able to get their second dose. Just in terms of that gap, other countries around the world have actually delayed the gap, put a bigger gap in between doses in order just to deal with the ongoing effects of the pandemic, bearing in mind that it's still quite effective with 1 dose, but its optimum effectiveness is with 2 doses. We don't have to do that in New Zealand. All of the trials have been based on that 3-week gap, and so we're able to, if you like, follow the manufacturer's instructions, whereas other countries are having to make other prioritisation choices.
What work are you doing with employers groups to organise for the big rollout in the second half of the year so that employers can encourage workers to get vaccinated and organise facilities and that sort of stuff?
So we've been talking to employers, a number of big employers, as well as the district health boards. So district health boards and primary healthcare organisations already have relationships with a lot of employers around things like the flu jab, for example. So they'll be utilising those networks. At a political level, we've been engaging with with the big companies and with business leaders to make sure they're willing to play their part. Look, that's ultimately a choice for him, a decision for him. I don't want this to become a political football. We made it. It was a very difficult decision to make about when we went, so that it didn't become a political football. And I'd prefer to keep it that way.
Our innovation has also given some New Zealand vaccine producers some more money, about $400,000, to continue producing a New Zealand vaccine. What are your thoughts on that?
Do you want to comment on that?
So I think one of the opportunities is in the future, and clearly not for this vaccine rollout, to see what domestic vaccine production we could have in New Zealand, and it would mean, should this happen again, or should we need to in future years adapt a vaccine to new variants, we have more options or potential option in New Zealand.
Have other health spokespeople or COVID spokespeople indicated to you that they won't take up your offer?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Minister Hipkins is currently on a bit of a roadshow in the north, visiting marae, talking to communities. Given the volume of mistrusted information that's out there, do you think his efforts are enough to push Māori across the line?
Oh, look, it's going to take more than just Minister Hinari. Obviously, he has a really important leadership role to play there, but we're also working to make sure that our kaumātua are coming forward, having their vaccinations. Again, it's good role modelling. We're seeing a good degree of interest there. High-profile people who are within the age bracket, for example, that we've moved up the sequencing framework. We'll be asking them to come forward as well, and provide opportunities for people to, as you did today, see them being vaccinated too. So there's a lot of work around that. So you should expect over the next sort of couple of months to see more and more of these types of events, maybe not quite on this scale, but with opportunities for those role models to be demonstrating their confidence in the vaccine.
20 minutes on, how are you guys feeling?
100%.
Yeah, pretty good.
In light of Rebecca Kitteridge's second round
Yes.
of review, should the government have done more in those sort of 102 days where we had no community cases found before the August cluster? Were we as prepared as we should have been?
Look, I think we always have to go back and remember that there's no rule book here, so we have been having to make up new systems as we've been going along, and there's been a lot that's been learned around that. I think we have been focused on continual improvement. It's always easy to look in the rearview mirror and say, could we have done something differently? In that 100 or so days we had, are there other things we could have done with the benefit of hindsight based on what we now know? Probably yes, but you have to keep looking forward. So from my perspective, have we got a system that's always looking for areas to improve? Yes, I think we do.
Do you think that we did, surely the surge capacity of contact tracing should have been tested before the August outbreak? The Director General was talking about doing that at the beginning of June, yet it still hadn't been done by the start of August. Do you know why it took so long to...
Well, one of the great frustrations there, yes, it did take a wee while, was that we actually had a couple of simulations planned and ready to go, and they were literally going to happen the week that we dealt with that we started dealing with the August cluster. So we had a real-time simulation, and the systems performed very, very effectively during that time.
Well, the contact tracing was 60% rather than 80% over that August cluster, though. Don't you think stress testing it might have meant?
Look, I'll get Dr. Verrill to comment on the numbers, but one of the things that I've been at pains to point out is that there are some things about the August outbreak and about some of the smaller groups that we've dealt with since then that have had an impact on the overall performance metrics, including when we find out about the index case. That has a significant bearing on it. And in terms of border cases coming across coming into New Zealand, we're always going to be behind the 8 ball with those because they've been infected elsewhere, and therefore there's a reasonable elapsed period of time before we even meet these people. So, but I might ask Dr. Verrill to comment on that.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is to compare the two large South Auckland outbreaks that we've had. In the August cluster, I think there was 150 cases. We had about a tenth of that in the Valentine's Day cluster. We had a total of 6,000 contacts traced in the more recent cluster, which is 2,000 more than the August cluster, and we had 88%, I think, or definitely over 80% within that 48-hour time frame. So there's been a huge amount of volume we can see now can go through the contact tracing system. It's hugely effective because it's kept the case numbers down to a tenth of what they were, and it's performing really fast. So that improvement has occurred over the last few months.
So what advice have you got back so far from the Brian Roche group?
No formal advice so far. I've had one conversation with Sir Brian. They're obviously out there doing their preliminary work. They've already started to, shape up what they're looking at. They're having a good look at the most recent, cases that we've had to deal with. But I haven't had any formal advice back from them on that.
We're not having a 1 o'clock briefing today, so is there anything we need to be aware of overnight? Any developments?
No new cases other than border cases. I think from memory it's 2 or 3 border cases overnight.
And is that more of that India group that came
haven't had the breakdown of them yet. That typically comes through around 11, so we get a bit of a breakdown. But yes, we are seeing quite a few cases coming through that. It's an Emirates flight that tends to bring a lot of people from India. We do see quite a high concentration of cases on that. Having said that, it's a very full flight, and so obviously, some of the other flights coming in may only have a few cases on them, but they're also half empty sometimes. So this is a very full flight, and it's obviously coming from a country where COVID-19 is very rampant, and so we would expect to see some of that.
What's not working? Is it the pre-departure testing? Is it the checks of people's conditions on flights? What's not working?
So I am getting some more advice on the pre-departure testing, whether or not we have full confidence in the test results, or whether there's any evidence that that system is being abused. So I haven't had that advice yet. They'll be doing some more auditing and some more checking in order to give us that advice. It's important to remember, though, that pre-departure testing's not a fail-safe. So 72 hours before departure is the time frame that we give someone. It's still possible to contract COVID and get a positive test result by the time you arrive in New Zealand, bearing in mind that if you're travelling a long way, there's another 24 hours often on top of that time before they actually arrive here in New Zealand. So the fact that we're seeing a reasonably significant portion of our cases coming through that particular travel path, testing positive either at day 0 or at day 3, that in itself doesn't necessarily tell us that the pre-departure testing isn't performing as it should, but it does tell us that the countries that they're coming from have COVID-19 very, very active in their communities.
Do you look at with sort of you're saying it's a very full flight, and that's perhaps how these infections happen? Do you have any sort of powers or anything that you can do to ensure social distancing on private airlines?
No. Well, I guess there's always a balance here. One of the things we have to be mindful of is we still want airlines to fly to New Zealand. So that particular flight brings a lot of our medical supplies. And so we need to have that flight continuing to come into New Zealand, and we don't want the airlines to walk away from New Zealand. Ultimately, the people on the flight will be coming to New Zealand one way or the other. And so, if, potentially by some of the changes we could make, and again, I haven't had the full advice on this, could potentially just relocate those same passengers but to different flights, so they're just be coming via a different route.
So would you look at stopping accepting passengers from an original destination like India or the UK or America?
Look, we've always been really clear that New Zealand citizens, permanent residents, have a right to return home. We do our best to make sure that they can do that safely. If you look at the number of cases we're getting in our managed isolation facilities, I think we're up to about 800 cases in total that we've seen through our managed isolation facilities, and that's across about 125,000 people who have come back since we've started doing this. So it's still a very low proportion of positive cases that we're seeing coming through. Having said that, it's a risky business, and so hence we work really hard to drive risk out of it.
But couldn't you reduce the risk a lot by saying we're not accepting people from this destination?
Look, we've always been clear, and our position's not going to change on this, that New Zealand citizens and residents should be able to return home.
But it's not just citizens and residents, is it a little bit disingenuous, because it is other people coming in who meet the requirements on that skills list? So could you say, to Bernard's question, could you say, oh look, we won't take people from that category from these particular regions?
Oh, look, I mean, that's quite difficult. So if you look, for example, in some cases we've got some family reunification happening there. Be very reluctant to start drawing hard and fast lines around that and saying, well, if you're coming from a particular place, you can come, but you can't. There's already a lot of demand from people who aren't meeting the criteria as it stands now.
On the Pfizer agreement, if the US and UK expect by July to have enough vaccine in their country to vaccinate everyone who wants one, whereas we're only going to start a general rollout, from that same date. Was there anything that you could have done in those negotiations with Pfizer to get our vaccines earlier than July?
Oh, look, our teams obviously, we're trying to get the supply of vaccines as fast as they possibly could. We are expecting the supplies to start arriving quite fast from July. So at that point, the campaign will really ramp up. Because we potentially will have vaccines arriving in the country faster than we can administer them. So from July onwards, we're really ready to go with we've got to be ready to go with a really big push at that point.
So it was the issue that, there wasn't enough supply of vaccine that Pfizer could send to us before July because it had previously already been signed off by other countries?
Look, the feedback I've had from our negotiators is that Pfizer have actually been very reliable in not committing to something that they can't deliver, and once they give us a commitment, they actually meet the commitment that they've given us. And so, they've been really upfront with what they can and can't do. And we've obviously taken everything that we can take in terms of what they've offered us. But, they're under a lot of pressure to supply as many countries with as many doses as possible, as fast as possible.
But why can they commit to giving other countries more vaccines sooner than New Zealand? What were we missing?
Look, I wouldn't say that we were necessarily missing anything, bearing in mind that our original negotiations were based on a balanced portfolio of vaccines, so a variety of different vaccines. At that point, we didn't know which were going to be the most effective vaccines. Our 750 doses that we're getting earlier on, we're getting because we basically took a gamble on a variety of different vaccines in that early period. Once we knew that Pfizer was really effective and was going to prove to be one of the most effective in the early, vaccine development, we looked to increase our orders. But obviously, that meant that that second wave of orders isn't going to be as high up the list as the first lot were. But having said that, if we had gone ahead and purchased 5 million right from the very beginning of every one of the vaccines that were available to us, that wasn't necessarily a practical option for us either. So, I think we did get the balance about right, getting a balanced portfolio. Ultimately, though, we've always said it's when we finish that matters, rather than when we start. And that second part of the year for us is going to be critical.
So what would you see as herd immunity that we need to get to?
I might ask Dr. Verrill to lend her expertise there.
Yeah, it's a really difficult question because I think we need to look at the overall calculations and how we think what our overall vaccine coverage level should be. But people don't behave in real life like they do in a computer simulation model, and we don't mix randomly throughout the population. So one of the risks is if we set an average target, but we have subpopulations, a part of the country or a particular ethnic community that isn't vaccinated to that level, perhaps we could get outbreaks in that group. So what we're working on now is how to understand that better so that we can have a sophisticated understanding of what the public health consequences will be of reopening borders.
Have you got an idea when you might get to herd immunity given the current rollout plans?
Well, we have a rollout plan to be able to offer everyone a vaccine this year.
And have regions been identified where uptake might be less than in other parts of the country?
No.
So would that be sort of regional or demographic targets that you would set?
Yeah, so we're seeking more advice on exactly how to think about these sorts of matters so that we can share that more sophisticated understanding of how to talk about coverage. We'll have more to say about how we're going to get to that this week.
Do you expect to have more, a clearer idea or work on policy around whether vaccinated people can enter the country without, by skipping out?
Yeah, so those questions are related, and one of the key issues about whether vaccinated people can enter the country is this evidence about transmission blocking, because if the vaccine still allows you to being vaccinated, there has been a suggestion that being vaccinated still allows you to be a carrier. I think the evidence is tipping against that, but we need a definitive position on the science to allow that to happen.
Is there any idea about how long, because presumably there's new studies being done every week, is there any idea about what sort of time period, that you might get enough evidence to make some sort of call on it? Just based on how.
Yeah, obviously it's very hard to say what studies haven't been published yet, so yeah, that's pretty tricky.
I think just there's a couple of other things that I'd add in here too. At this point, we don't have a vaccine approved for the under 16s, and that's obviously a significant proportion of our population, but we will know more in the second half of the year around whether Pfizer will be available for that group or whether one of the other vaccines that we have access to might be suitable for that group, and that will have a bearing. And then the effectiveness for that population group of whatever vaccine is available to them, again, adds to the calculation. So I saw the comment yesterday, it's not rocket science. Well, it's also not that simple either. And being simplistic about it could potentially be a very bad thing if you don't get the right people being vaccinated at the right time with the right vaccine.
Yesterday, MIQ's made some changes to exercise classes. How shocking is it to you to hear that until then they were not getting briefed that they should stay in
Yeah, look, there is a standard operating procedure here. It's clear that it wasn't being fully followed. That's frustrating. I think that steps have been taken to make sure that that system is really tightened up. It's still quite low risk, but it's not no risk, and therefore we have to be vigilant to drive the risk out.
Surely you should be focusing on really, really tightening anything that could go wrong and prioritising an Australian bubble.
Obviously, the Trans-Tasman bubble is a big conversation. We'll have a bit more to say about that next Tuesday, following Cabinet's final consideration of the issue. Work's being done to shape up that advice over the next sort of 48 hours or so that ministers will have that for their Easter reading, so that we can make decisions when we meet on Tuesday. It will help to ease some of the pressure off our managed isolation facilities, but that doesn't necessarily mean, as I've said before, that all of that capacity then gets released for people coming from other areas. We are looking very closely at whether all of the facilities we're using are the best places to be, and whether there are any facilities that we should look at decommissioning, and whether there are other facilities we should be looking at opening. Obviously, this is a system that was set up quickly. It's served us incredibly well, but we are likely to be doing it for at least through to the end of the year. And so as we go through the process of renewing contracts and so on, we're looking again at are there things about some of those facilities that make them less suitable to be managed isolation facilities. And one of those things is, if there's not a nearby area where people can get outside and we are having to bus them a reasonable distance, is that something that we'll consider?
There's changes to the buses. That stuff goes right back to what was in the Kittredge report about being too reactive and not prepared enough. Surely people should have been told ages ago that they should be seated in the right seats and with masks on.
Yeah, look, the infection prevention and control audits have made recommendations, for regular improvement. This is one of the things that they have looked at, and they've made recommendations previously. There are standard operating procedures in place here. It was clear, certainly with the bus ride of concern, from last week, that many or some of those, standard expectations hadn't been followed there.
Is the government looking at changing the law or any regulations so that employers who say no jab, no job can actually do that? Because under the law, that's actually not possible.
So my advice to any employers, and we're working very closely with the border employers, my advice to any employers is make sure that you're getting good, sound legal advice before you make any such decisions. There has to be a health basis and a reasonable degree of risk before you could say that in order to do a certain job someone needs to be vaccinated. Now, bearing in mind that's different to saying that if someone's currently doing that job they have to be vaccinated, because people can refuse a vaccination. That's absolutely acceptable, but it might mean that some of their responsibilities have to change if they are in an environment where they're at higher risk. So my advice to all employers is bold public pronouncements probably don't help them. They should be there's quite a lot of nuance in this area, and so they should get some really good advice before making decisions.
Dr. Farrell, the Cancer Society has launched a petition to reduce the number of stores selling tobacco from, say, thousands to the hundreds. What are your thoughts on that petition?
Haven't seen the petition, but Labor's election manifesto included the smoke-free 2025 goal, and that included looking at how supply needs to change to achieve that goal, and that's part of the propose. We'll be putting out proposals for the smoke-free action plan in the coming month, and it'll include a range of options for getting to that goal.
Do you think it's not achievable to get to that goal?
Yes.
All right, we might last couple of questions. Yeah.
Any vaccine drops here?
What's that?
Any vaccine drops here?
I still feel fine. Is that what you're asking?
No vaccine drops. Remember the old dropping a box?
Oh, right.
That was factored into the...
No, not that I've heard of. My understanding is that actually our vaccine usage is running at a higher rate than the model was based on. So we're not seeing the wastage. Wastage can come from human error, but it can also come from just people not showing up for their vaccines and vaccines going to waste. And I think the teams at the front lines have been very conscientious about making sure that they're not wasting vaccines, that they're getting the maximum vaccine doses out of each vial and all of that kind of stuff. So we're seeing very, very high efficiency in the campaign.
Too conscientious, aren't they? walk in, people are getting vaccinated and people with appointments. And
look, I'm never going to criticise the vaccinators for saying, I think the case that you're referring to was they had a couple of vaccines left at the end of the day and they found some people to give them to. I would rather they did that than see those vaccines go to waste.
But the point yesterday was that people were waiting in the queue, made an appointment, and they missed out to people who walked in and got it.
Yeah, look, I think, like I said, they're constantly refining their system so that won't happen, but it's still early days of them dealing with larger numbers. So, doing 5,500 a day is different to doing, 1,000 in a day. And as they scale up, there will be bumps. And when we get up to that period where we're doing 50 or 60,000 in a day, there will undoubtedly be bumps in the road there where some people will end up queuing for longer than, they should reasonably be asked to. But we'll be, as I said, we're working really hard to make sure we've got systems in place to recalibrate, including moving vaccines around very quickly within a 2 to 3 hour window if we need to.
Could you increase that number from 50 to 60 if Pfizer were to say, yeah, we've got a spare couple of mil, you can do it faster?
Look, there's a variety of different things that have to be balanced up here. One is we have worked really closely to make sure that people can get their flu vaccinations with appropriate timing from before they get their COVID vaccinations, or vice versa, get their COVID vaccines and then their flu vaccines. It will require, if we did get earlier deliveries, we would need to do some recalibration. I can't guarantee that we would use every dose that arrived immediately that it arrived, but we certainly have the ability to be able to scale up faster if we need to.
You were asked about whether you'd had a vaccine within the past 4 weeks. Can you not receive the COVID-19 vaccine if you've had the flu shot within the past 4 weeks? And is it the same?
Yeah, there's a 2-week spacing recommended between the flu vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Cheers. Still standing, so there you go.
Are you going to invite us to your next one?
If you all want to come to the next one, you're going to come to the next one.